Yeah, thank you for this very kind introduction and also for the invitation to speak here. Yeah, you can see from the title of my talk, Understanding the System in its Entirety, that's actually a quote, and it's a quote of Franco Moretti, a comparatist in Stanford, who, it's a quote from the article Conjectures on World Literature, appeared in the New Left Review 2000. And this article actually played a key role in the theorization of the digital humanities. And in this article, actually, Moretti developed his famous and maybe also a bit infamous concept of distant reading. The starting point for this concept, for the development of this concept is that you might know is an actually very plausible observation by Moretti that can hardly be refuted, namely the observation that the sheer amount of text that exists in the world is simply too much for a single researcher to read them all. According to a meanwhile a bit outdated and of course somehow ironic estimate by the company Google a few years ago, there were exactly 129,864,880 books in the world, of which Google wanted to digitize a large proportion. This contrasts very much with estimates of between 5,000 to 10,000 books that an avid reader can read in his lifetime. One can easily see that this calculation cannot work. A single person can only ever overview a tiny section of the cultural production. Moretti's answer to this dilemma is probably well known and quite provocative. As it is no use reading more and more books anyway, Moretti recommends simply stopping reading, or to put it less sharply, he proposes reading in a different way. Distant reading, reading from a distance, should take the place of the precise close reading that Moretti says is typical for literary studies. Moretti originally conceived of this distant reading as a kind of patchwork research in which instead of reading the primary text, such as non-European novels, in which Moretti was interested at the time, only and exclusively secondary literature is read. But of course, distant reading is particularly suitable when you have a large amount of digitally available texts that can be analyzed using digital methods. And you could say that it was only with the transfer of the distant reading approach to the digital humanities that the method really took off. Of course, and Moretti also was aware of this, reading from a distance always entails a loss of accuracy and detail. This is an effect that ultimately always occurs when you look at the big picture, that you have to neglect the subtleties and the idiosyncrasies. But for getting an overview, you have to accept such a loss. Moretti expresses this in these words that you see here, and this is where my quote from the title comes in. If we want to understand the system in its entirety, we must accept losing something. We always pay a price for theoretical knowledge. Reality is infinitely rich, concepts are abstract or poor. But it's precisely this poverty that makes it possible to handle them and therefore to know. This is why less is actually more. So reading is no longer about individual texts, but about a system that is to be elucidated in its entirety. And I would like to work through this a little in the following, or consider what it means when the focus shifts from the individual texts to the system in its entirety in the digital, perhaps even virtual literary studies. The need for abstraction that Moretti calls for in the quote shown is not only supported by a logical and, so to speak, epistemological argument. If there are more books than you can read, you can never know the whole truth, but also by a moral one, so to speak. Because despite this reading gap, literary studies have always been practiced even before the advent of distant reading, but only, so that's at least what Moretti would say, by using a trick, so to speak. And this trick consists of a pre-selection of the number of books and texts worth analyzing by selecting a canon. Close reading can only be practiced if some books are considered better or more valuable than others. From a post-colonial perspective, however, this leads to unpleasant effects, such as the fact that the canon centers on Western literature by white men. Close reading, one could paraphrase, is therefore not only logically wrong, but also morally wrong to a certain extent. Under these conditions, it's actually clear that the digitization of text and the analysis of text is not only a question of external form, but also brings with it shifts in emphasis and perspective. Instead of dealing with texts individually, there are analyses on a macro level that are oblivious to detail, in which aesthetic evaluation is given less importance than the analysis of structural patterns. Of course, this shift to the macro perspective is only one possibility of the effects that result from digitization. We have already seen in the first part of the section that the virtualization of text can, on the contrary, also lead to particularly detail-obsessed approaches. Christine Lechtermann and Mark Stock and also Stefan Rieger have already described these contradictory tendencies that the virtualization of philology and the digitization of pre-modern text in particular entail in their essays resulting from the CRC. On the one hand, digital facsimiles of manuscripts, for example, make it possible to bring the materiality of pre-modern texts into view and to undertake meticulous paleographic studies of fine scribal peculiarities without ever catching up with this materiality. On the other hand, there is a text completely abstracted from its materiality and individuality in the code, which can be transmedialized into the most diverse forms and, not least, diagrammatically altered. In my talk, I'm particularly concerned with the second type of text, not least because the movement from one extreme to the other has also accompanied my work on Middle High German texts biographically. I actually entered the world of digital humanities by working on this digital scholarly edition, which was already mentioned, this transmission-centered edition of Parzival, of the prominent Parzival novel by Wolfram von Eschenbach. And you could say that this edition has made the constitution of the text incredibly complicated. This is the interface of the edition, and instead of one Parzival text, you have to read four texts, four versions of the text, and you can also extend this notion towards the single manuscripts, which you can link, which you can reach through links from the front page and see the transcriptions of the single manuscripts and also the facsimile. So this kind of digitization brings materiality to the fore. The visualization leads to an archive of diverse text versions that are also interesting in their materiality. Of course, this materiality can only be modeled in digital form. It's not the object itself; you can touch it, but it's a model of the object. And but this modeling certainly leaves its mark also in the code. Modern digital editions generally use the guidelines of the Text Encoding Initiative as a data model for transcriptions and annotate handwritten features in the XML. With TI, for example, initials, abbreviations, and handwritten corrections can be explicitly noted in the code. And indeed, a large part of the transcription work in the Parzival project, which I was working on, went into coding such phenomena. Another example could, for instance, be this. This is a 14th century manuscript of Parzival, also known as the Rapelsteiner Parzival, and you can see it obviously was heavily erased and corrected after sort of a compilation of different sources. So there was some heavy work going on the text, and this can be seen. There were even some marginal notes scratched out, and you can at least reflect this work in text by using TI code and putting this in the transcription. In the course of working on the edition, I became more and more involved with text analysis, and here the picture is actually completely revised in terms of text constitution and coding. As we have just seen in the quote from Moretti, digital text analysis are primarily aimed at large volumes of text at the macro level. This is because the most efficient methods of digital text analysis are ultimately statistical, probabilistic ones. And as we know, statistics only work well when you have a large amount of data. So the text I had to deal with in the text analysis therefore looked a bit like this. So pure, almost completely unstructured plain text files obtained from large repositories and databases. So sometimes they even look like this. This is a nice example of a database dump gone wrong. These are the texts defined in repositories, very much unstructured, very abstracted. Working with computational linguists, for example, was particularly instructive in this aspect. You could say that the first thing a computational linguist do is when he sees a TI text, he strips off the markup and leaves it all out because it's only a bias for computational analysis. So, which are the databases for these texts? One of the prominent databases is in which these digital texts are kept is the Mittelhigh-German Begriffsdatenbank, the Mittelhochdeutsche Begriffsdatenbank, and it's actually a pioneering project from the early days of digital humanities. It actually exists since the 1970s. And it is incredibly meritorious because it offers an extensive amount of German medieval texts. In the old version of this Mittelhigh-German Begriffsdatenbank, there were exactly 666 texts, so a very dangerous number. This changed a bit because in recent times, because they published a relaunch of the website recently, and they kicked out some of the double text because the text, as we will soon see, are very coarsely selected. So nowadays it holds a bit less text than these 660 texts. The question that has been bothering me for a long time is this. Is this the text, these 666 texts, is this the system in its entirety that Moretti is talking about? Is the database as complete as Moretti has in mind, or is it at least representative of a basic population of the medieval High German texts? Lechtermann and Stock have pointed out that Middle High German text could actually be a very grateful data corpus in certain respects because the velocity of the data volume is relatively low. There are simply no new Middle High German texts being produced nowadays, except maybe for some fanatical philologists who write Middle High German in the quiet chambers, but that doesn't fall much into account. As you know, Middle High German text exists primarily in manuscripts, and many of these manuscripts have been lost over time. So even if there is a closed corpus, it's not a complete one because there are always some texts missing. That's not the whole truth about Middle High German that we have, because some texts are missing out of transmission reasons. So if the corpus grows, then the most likely way would be that some librarians discover fragments previously unseen with texts unseen, but that also happens only from time to time. This increase will be marginal. In principle, the amount of Middle High German text is fixed and stable. Thus, it should actually be possible to count the number of Middle High German texts. However, this will, of course, remain a chimera, as will, and here anticipate the result of my discussion of the Moretti quote, this will also remain a chimera, as will the attempt to understand the system in its entirety. That would be at least my opinion. There are, of course, namely a number of demarcation problems that stand in the way of this endeavor. First of all, of course, what is a text? As we know, this question can be answered differently depending on the perspective. In the context of medieval literature, for example, the question arises as to whether each manuscript manifestation of a text should be counted as a text in its own right, or whether the manuscript transmission of sometimes more or less divergent text versions should be aggregated into a single work. But you don't even have to go that far, because the question of what should be counted as a text is also difficult across genres. This is shown, for example, by the very pragmatic classification of texts in the Begriffsdatenbank. Longer novels and chronicles and other texts are generally counted as one text, as one entry in the database, but short stories are often aggregated into text corpora, and which are usually organized by author name and are counted as one text out of these 660 texts. So this very exact, very frightening number of 666 texts is rather ephemeric anyways, because it combines very different notions of text and a very different concept of text count. So the demarcation, what is a text, becomes completely difficult with lyric poetry, because here it is often almost impossible to tell whether verses belong together in a song or not. Thus, the Begriffsdatenbank does not record individual songs, but the lyrical production is also assigned to an author in aggregated form, as you can see here. Lyrik des von Büchern, Lyrik des von Glier. That's also one. That's always one entry in the text database, and one counts as one text. And the equation of one data record equals one text does not even work for the longer text. For example, the very extensive Prosa Lancelot is divided into 3 files. In fact, this text could be regarded as a trilogy, but all 3 parts are assigned to a sort of super text with the same name. So this is also a question: is the parts, well, is the Lancelot, are these 3 texts, or is this one text? So the Prosa Lancelot does makes up 3 of the 660 texts, so the order of the text is disrupted. From a manuscript point of view, you could also add several other examples where text identity is in question. For instance, the case of the famous case of the Nibelungenlied and the Nibelungenklage, which are always transmitted together but are regarded as 2 different texts, and they are formally also different, but in the transmission they always go together. Or you have the case of the Mantel narration and the Erik of Hartmann von Auer, which is only transmitted once, and then they are transmitted together. So in the manuscript they appear as one text, but not in the hindsight of analysis. So all in all, the categorization of text in the Mittelhochdeutsche Begriffsdatenbank is therefore quite pragmatic and conventional. The Begriffsdatenbank has not created its own scholarly editions, but ultimately follows the underlying print editions and their delimitations. The second demarcation problem is that Middle High German itself is not a clearly defined term. The Mittelhochdeutsche Begriffsdatenbank contains texts from around the 11th to the 16th century, and during this time German changed quite a lot, and this of course continuously. So there's no point at which you can say that this is still a Middle High German text and this is not anymore a Middle High German text. What's more, the language is not standardized and it's also regionally inconsistent. So I'm actually not sure whether pre-digital research has ever attempted to take stock of medieval German literature to count the whole production of medieval German literature. Some things that come close to it might be things like the Verfasserlexikon, a comprehensive index that is also organized by person or author. Only if these authors are not known, individual works are provided as catalog entries in the Verfasserlexikon. There's also the Handschriftenzensus, which is available digitally and in particular records the transmission of the text. And here an attempt is made at least partially to catalog each work individually. But also with lyric poetry, this doesn't work. So you have the lyric production of Reinmar dem Alten, you have under one entry. So together, we find 6,725 lemmatas in the Handschriftenzensus, which could be the system in its entirety. So it's the whole production of medieval or the Middle High German literature. So when texts are digitized, that virtualization removes their object-like quality. If texts are available as books, the size and the thickness of the book can be used to roughly estimate how extensive a text is. This can sometimes be deceptive, as text editions can be of different sizes and densely printed or equipped with paratext, but in the analog world you would at least get an approximate feeling for the size of a text by looking at the book or by looking at the bookshelf. Although hardly any researcher will have seen the over 6,000 works from the Handschriftenzensus index as a whole in a library, they may have seen individual texts side by side and therefore have a feeling for the proportions. In the digital repository, it's the other way around. Here you would theoretically have all the text at a glance, but the entries reveal nothing about the size of the text. It would probably be of little help if you just print the numbers of words next to the catalog. Much easier accessible would be an overview in a diagrammatical form. And this would be such an overview. This is the truth about the length of Middle High German texts. You can see that there are some texts which are very extensive, for instance, some chronicles, and also the already mentioned Prosa Lancelot, and they take a huge amount of the medieval corpus. And these are, of course, only the first few texts in the ranking. There are, of course, lots of other texts which are of very small length, even especially if you split the lyric poetry, then you would have very short text. So it has almost a power law distribution, the text length. So it could be that there are some texts that make up a very large proportion of the corpus, and the corpus is therefore, you could say, a bit skewed. What is at stake here is the principle of the representativeness of the corpus, which was brought into play in corpus linguistics as a proposed solution for the problem of the basic population of text production, which can never be precisely defined. The lack of balance also becomes apparent when one looks at the chronological distribution of the texts. In the case of Middle High German literature, such a chronological distribution can also only be carried out imprecisely, because large proportion of pre-modern texts are not precisely dated, but this dating can only be deduced secondarily, for example, through references and allusions in the text. This means that many of these dates are also disputed in research. Nevertheless, I have tried to approximate this chronological division of these texts into periods of 50 years, which I've compared with relevant lexicons such as the Verfasserlexikon, just to make sure. And I've now compiled the total number of tokens for these periods, and you can see now that the corpus has a considerable focus on the 13th and 14th century and is not really meaningful for all the other periods. Thus, if you want to examine the system in its entirety by drawing on more and more texts, you soon realize that the system is somewhat skewed and dominated by certain texts and periods. This becomes particularly clear when we have a relatively small corpus, such as the Middle High German texts. So, Stefan Rieger has pointed out that the traditional philologies perhaps are having such difficulties with the digital humanities because it conceived its subject matter in a phase that was characterized by a very strong notion of authorship. In fact, the link between texts and strong authorship begins to dissolve when they are digitized. And this even applies to the two opposing types of digitization to which I referred earlier. For the first variant of digitization, this is quite clear. The manuscript transcriptions, which are mostly tagged in TI, bring different versions of a text into view and thus dissolve this text into traditions. You can even prolong this tradition, as we have seen in the first talk, until in the afterlife of the text and its provenance in different libraries. The text becomes a product of the tradition, not an authorial structure created in a unique creative act. The situation is somewhat less clear with the plain texts that are offered for analysis in large corpora. In fact, and there are some prominent digital humanities methods that focus particularly strongly on authorship. I'm talking here about what is known as stylometry, which is used in particular to recognize the authorship of anonymous texts. It has been shown that by simply counting the most frequently occurring words in the text, it's relatively easy to predict which texts are similar and possibly by the same author. Here you can see an example of such an analysis for some texts of Middle High German literature. And the computer just receives the text and counts the words and calculates the most frequently occurring words in them. With the help of distance measures, it then calculates it compares the word profile of the individual texts, and the texts are clustered together on the basis of the score of these distance measures. For stylometric analysis, a tree-like representation is common, in which the most similar texts are on the outer right side, on the finest branches. The texts that appear together on the outermost branches are things are the ones that the computer thinks are similar, only based on the distribution of the word frequencies. And you can see that it also works quite well for Middle High German texts. So, but the computation method, so this would be an actually very author-centric transformation of digital text, but computational philological methods have not stopped there. The decisive breakthrough of natural language processing in recent years, which have led to computers being able to use large language models to generate meaningful text, or, for example, translate it into other languages, are ultimately based on a shift in computational linguistics towards distributional semantics and the representation of words in word embeddings. Distributional semantics is based on the assumption that the meaning of a word is not derived from itself, but from the context in which a word appears. This idea is brought to the point in the famous quote of the linguist John Firth, "You shall know a word by the company it keeps." The principle gets rather evident in the case of ambiguous terms. If, for example, the word bank in a text is surrounded by many expressions from the financial sectors, then it's quite likely that the financial institution is meant. If there is lots of waters and rivers in the vicinity of the word, then the meaning of a river bank is likely to be present. The concept now is particularly apt for computers because these contextual probabilities can also be expressed as numerical values and packed into vectors. Thus, series of numbers that characterize words as embeddings and can also be used for calculations. You can, for instance, calculate the similarity of two vectors with a distance measure, and according to the prediction of the model, words with similar vectors are mostly also similar in meaning. This allows the computer to deal with deeper text meanings that go beyond the explicit text surface, which can be modeled surprisingly well. However, the reasonable stable calculation of these context probabilities requires a whole lot of data that goes far beyond author corpora. Modern corpus philology can therefore not really afford to limit itself to author corpora or even domains. In the embedding model, texts of all kinds are mixed together. It doesn't matter who wrote them. They lose their author's signature and become training material of the same order. However, this circumstance seems to be much more precarious for a text corpus such as Middle High German, for which only small amounts of text and thus training data are available, than for modern languages, where one can fall back on much more extensive amounts of data. I will try to demonstrate this by means of some experiments with words embeddings that I carried out for Middle High German. I trained a token-based embedding model on the corpus of the Mittelhochdeutsche Begriffsdatenbank using the now somewhat antiquated Word-to-Vec method, which is a method from around 10 years ago, which was developed by Google back in 2013. But even for this method, extensive databases are required to train such a model, and the question arises as to whether what we have in the Mittelhochdeutsche Begriffsdatenbank, for example, is sufficient to produce such a model in a valid way. The Begriffsdatenbank contains around 10 million tokens, which sounds a lot at the first glance, but you have to bear in mind that, as already mentioned, the database contains very different texts, and some of which represent very different language levels of German and may have dialectal characteristics and orthographical variation. So the training material is therefore by no means as standardized as would be the case with modern languages. Nevertheless, at first glance, it seems possible to generate a reasonably useful model. If you created a word-to-vec model, you can, for example, approximate the similarity of words by comparing the embedding vectors, and you can also calculate with these vectors. For example, in most models of natural language texts, if you subtract the vector of man from the vector of the word king and add the vector of woman, you get a vector that comes closest to the vector of the word queen. And such a calculation now obviously also works for a model trained on the Begriffsdatenbank. So this figure lists the 10 words that are according to the model have the highest vector similarity to the result of this calculation, König plus Frau minus man, and indeed the first ranked word is Königin, so the right answer given by the model. This fact has encouraged me to make some inquiries into the historical semantics of virtue terms on the basis of these word-to-vec models. For example, the models can be used to generate word fields and observe the shifts in relation to one another. I just flipped this through. This is just for demonstration purposes, what you can do with the models. So for this, timely separated analysis, I further divided my corpus into subcorpora of 50 years. So the amount of training data gets even less, which is, of course, more of a problem. So with such an approach, the question almost naturally arises as to how valid the results obtained here actually are. Word embedding models are relatively difficult to evaluate, but some detailed results in my models have emerged that make me relatively skeptical. So to cut this story short, the model does seem to work well for words that are fairly common, but for rarer words, its informative value becomes borderline. So it therefore makes sense to try to put the embedding models on a broader basis. To do this, I tried to gradually expand the corpus of the Begriffsdatenbank and find further digitized text that can be added to the training corpus. The interesting effect that now has emerged with the expansion of the corpus is that the models have obviously not gotten better, but rather worse, if you like. So this was the outcome. For example, after adding a few texts, the word-to-vec model was no longer able to correctly calculate this famous calculation, but rather ranked Jungfrau in front of Königin. At the same time, however, the question immediately arises, is this model really wrong at all? Or does it not simply reflect completely correctly the semantic relationships that arise when less curtly and perhaps less canonical texts are fed into the corpus? Perhaps in the semantic reality of these texts, king to man is not the same as queen to woman, but rather the same as Jungfrau to woman. So there's a huge amount of, for instance, religious texts, and especially legendaries, for instance, so this means collections of the lives of saints, which are not edited and not integrated in digital corpora, and this would offer considerable potential for corpus enlargement, and these texts are still very little available in the Begriffsdatenbank. These texts are very extensive and by definition always tell the same story, since the basic structure of the individual saint's life is, so to speak, predetermined, but still they offer so much variation that individual legendaries could be addressed as individual texts. So I would ask myself, what would happen if these texts were consistently fed into the text model? Would this system then be better understood in its entirety, or would semantic shifts not rather result, which then perhaps only do justice to some of the texts of the model? So you might also argue that I didn't really use large language models like ChatGPT so far, as they got common in NLP recently. But I would still expect that the problem, what are we talking about when we are talking of the Middle High German system in its entirety, still remains also with these large language models that draw on even more data. So I'm sorry to say I wasn't able to fine-tune such a LLM for Middle High German right now. I just did some vanilla prompting experiments. So this maybe just for illustration. So also ChatGPT is able to detect this, that König ist der Mann, like Frau ist die Königin. And it's also, yeah, but the problem starts, of course, when you go deeper into the details, because it, as a close candidate, it also proposes a word Maya, which I never heard of. I don't know if any one of you. So it starts hallucinating, but it rightly says that it can't draw on corpus studies. So it's obviously it's not. It's out of the scope of the model. One could also ask the model if there is a semantic shift of some terms. I'm sorry that's a bit small printed. I hope you can read, at least grasp the meaning. So, and it will tell you, so it's aware that there are semantic shifts and that there are courtly conceptions and more religious conceptions and more bourgeois conceptions, as it calls it. But I think the word list that it proposed is also more or less cliche, so you can't go deeper into the text with this, but the model also admits that it has to be, that it has to have access to corpus. So this is just a glance on ChatGPT. Here a fine-tuning would be needed, and this, like always in the digital humanities, this should be future work and will be postponed for for later occasions. So for the moment, I will turn back to methodological considerations and try to sum up my talk a bit. Christine Lechtermann and Mark Stock have pointed out that behind every editorial reproduction of a medieval text there is a promise of authenticity, which consists in the claim that the text is, so to speak, reproduced correctly, even though this reproduction is not the original form of the manuscript. The editorial text is the text, or should be the text itself, even if it was originally transmitted completely differently. So with plain text and text corpora, it seems to me that such a promise of authenticity is now also being made, albeit in a less explicit form than is the case with edited texts. The digital plain text from the Middle High German Begriffsdatenbank do not make a bold claim to authenticity. In fact, some of the text editions underlying these digital texts, which the database draws on, are from editions that are now considered outdated and old-fashioned and no longer authentic. Thus, the text compilation is primarily pragmatic, and the operators of the database would certainly admit that. But if you're doing text mining on this text, then 100% authenticity might not even be that important. As mentioned before, a macro perspective distant reading analysis is not too keen on details anyway. A little bit of blurriness can be tolerated, and it's all about looking at the big picture. Different versions of the text do not play a role in such digital repositories. On the contrary, it would even further disturb and distort the analysis if one and the same text were recorded multiple times in different versions. Nevertheless, it seems to me that the claim to truth or authenticity comes into play through this empirical evaluation, which is reflected in Moretti's idea of understanding the system in its entirety. Only when you have all the texts, or at least large amount of text, you can finally learn the truth about literature, and especially about the literature that does not belong to the canon. This would be my paraphrase of Moretti. That is a noble goal, but I'm not so sure that the calculation will work out. As I hope I've made clear, the problem of differentiation according to domains stand in the way of this. I would agree with Moretti that statements about larger contexts can only be reached with a certain degree of abstraction, and that one does not therefore have to refrain from making these statements. But especially when you have little data, it quickly becomes clear that the system in its entirety very quickly falls apart into its individual parts. What are now the consequences for infrastructure? If digital textual analysis will ever find their way into mainstream philology, and I think they should, databases like the Begriffsdatenbank will be the future archives that build the base for philological research. I think that it goes without saying that even given the coarseness of this macro analysis, the files should be based on proper editions. But that is not all. I think we also need more reflection on what we are trying to collect in such databases. Do we really want to grasp the system in its entirety, or should we reflect more on different domains and periods and how we can aggregate them? How should we deal with different versions and hierarchies of texts? Notions of text are strongly shaped by the means with which we store them and how we analyze them. This also holds true if we only put our printed texts in databases like the Begriffsdatenbank. As I said, the claim for authenticity in this case is an only implicit one, which is generated from the claim of distant reading techniques to experience the truth about the system in its entirety. But in my opinion, this implicitness of the claim also indicates that the reflection how our notions of textuality are shaped by these methods is still only implicit, is still only implicitly reflected upon. And this would be sort of my credo. I think we still need to think about more what we are actually trying to explore if we are using NLP methods and especially language models. Thank you very much.